Hi, and welcome to week 4. Of course, as you know, we will start with our overview, and then, of course, we'll talk a little bit about what's happening for the following week. At this point, I'm thinking that most of you have kind of got the feel for the class, that you see that it's reading, interpretation, posting, response, and engagement. And I think that as I have went through the different areas and the different connections and things that you've done, I can see that you are starting to get the flow of how literature functions. Because as most of you expressed in the beginning, you don't all enjoy reading literature, but that you are starting to see that there are some ways that you can engage in the reading. So let me just get the let's start out kind of with the beginning, and we'll kind of move around a bit. Whoops. Okay, there we go. So, this week's readings really did focus on a sense of naturalism in reaction to a realistic point of view. And then, of course, we talked a little bit about the dichotomy of African American realism and naturalism. So, this is a kind of a rich area. I saw that David, who was our first poster, mentioned that, the naturalistic stories of the yellow wallpaper really did not hit the same thing, the same traits or tropes that he expected. Instead, it felt a little more supernatural, a little more outside of the box, a little more cerebral. Um, Now, of course, The Open Boat, as he mentions, could be adapted into a movie because it does really hit this kind of almost realistic naturalism, this very much pessimistic point of view. Um, the idea of the contrast between Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois was well thought out here, and I saw that a lot in many of your postings. For instance, that um, a lot of you really enjoyed reading Du Bois. Not so many of you enjoyed reading Washington. And I do think there is definitely a tension between the two, and it is still very much present in our common culture and understanding. I appreciate that Randolph mentioned the enjoyment of one text over the other. Now, I also think, for instance, and this is in Dennis's observation, the idea of mental illness came up. And this idea of not having control of one's mind really does feed into the naturalistic undertones that was reflected in this week's readings and in this week's kind of discussion-oriented area. Now, I appreciate the observations, in light of the notion that there's this sense of pessimism, there's this sense of futility, there's this sense that social Darwinism is going to take place. I really appreciate both Randolph and David's interactions with their peers, and these are great ways to model your responses. In fact, the post back to Dennis that Randolph put in there was fantastic. The idea that this story could be read from different perspectives. It's not just from this one perspective or this one setting. I also appreciate the observations that were made by Stephen in this, and which were really galvanized around the idea that naturalism portrayed characters that didn't have this control, both mental, physical, etc. And I think that by giving this kind of galvanizing statement or this main point, it really did allow for a good engagement and I guess you'd say a good lens from which to view the short stories through. Now, I also really enjoyed reading the Monique's observations, particularly because she really took the time to think about Gilman's essay, Why I Wrote the Yellow Wallpaper. And I think that taking a moment to understand the context, the historical context of Gilman's work is important. Because sometimes when we read something, we just put it into our time frame. We don't realize that this set of circumstances that caused this person to write this story was very different from ours. And I think we need to always keep that in mind, in particular when we're dealing with a text that's outside our field of reference. And I appreciate Monique's observations there. I also think that in many ways, the observation about disturbing and kind of this uncomfortable perspective that Carr points out from the yellow wallpaper is really clear and so connected to naturalism. You know, a lot of times people will say, they will watch a sad film, or they'll read a novel that's dealing with a depressing subject matter, and they're like, why are you watching a sad movie, or why are you reading this book that's about violence, or it's disturbing? And often you don't know how to answer that. And I think the key to answering it is that you are looking for this naturalistic impulse, this sense of that life is futile, and that you by reading and engaging these moments, you kind of see that. And I love that Cara mentioned that and pulled it out, because I think that's very key to understanding why naturalism had such a sway, and still, I would argue, has a sway on our culture. Mary had some great connections. I particularly like the open boat. This idea of control really does feed into the sense of naturalism, the sense of futility, the sense of frustration, the sense that nature is overcoming mankind. And then, of course, Mary also brought up postpartum depression, which is another way to look at Gilman's readings. I appreciate Karen's observations that really kind of connected the realistic elements from the biography of Gilman, from her essay to the story, as well as thinking about the connection between watching and writing, or watching and interpreting. Um, you know, Dennis does bring up the idea that there's tension with the main character in the yellow wallpaper. Is she poor? Is she uneducated? Is she unsophisticated? Is she does she lack understanding? Does she lack knowledge? Who is she, and why does she suffer this fate? And while I would love to have an answer to that, I would say that all of those observations are probably accurate. This is a woman who is very different from what we would conceive of as a woman now. She was probably viewed in many ways as property, or as at least a possession or an asset of her husband. Her idea of having an independent mind, or independent soul, or independent life outside of that of being a wife or a mother did not exist. So we could argue the level of sophistication really that is affected by that kind of perspective, or that kind of overview. Now, I do think Derek made some great connections. I love that he wrote, in conclusion, it seems as if there's an ugliness with naturalism. This hardship, poverty, death, slavery, facts of life. It touches the heart. It implies this compassion, but it does attempt to make you look at the ugliness of the world, which is kind of a different position than many of us find ourselves in when we are looking to read something. I also think that Stephen's observations, Addison's observations about the open boat, connecting it to the history of life in an open boat for 30 hours, would no doubt be instructive for the young. So that's the other element of naturalism that also reflects back to realism, the sense of being didactic, or being a teaching moment, or teaching a moral, is also kind of a component underlying, but still there in most naturalistic works. Kenneth, much like many of you, did really connect Gilman's story with almost a supernatural, or kind of a Edgar Allan Poe type text, you know, so kind of dark and mysterious, and at the same time having an almost supernatural position. Denise, kind of outside of kind of that supernatural, really did see the symbolism. And you will see symbols popping up a lot in literature. Symbols are one of the cool things about reading, because many things from the psychoanalytic perspective can be seen as a symbol. For instance, Denise mentions that the yellow wallpaper symbolized how the woman felt in her own body. You know, this emotional baggage, this notion of getting free, this notion of removing the artificial, I think is really key to not just understanding naturalism, but kind of starting to think symbolically. I appreciate the observations that Tammy made. I think the readings of Up From Slavery and The Souls of Black Folk were great dichotomies of the two perspectives with Du Bois in Washington. The idea that Du Bois wasn't angry, wasn't advocating for, wasn't advocating for a fight, but instead, that there is a sense of we must have a strategy. That this is coming up to violence, but not quite stepping over it, where Washington was really saying, this is a model instead of a strategy. So I agree, and I see the validity in Tammy's observations. Um, Kathy made some good points. Specifically, I so enjoy seeing the use of evidence. For instance, this paragraph here is fantastic because it gives this observation that Stephen Crane's The Open Boat epitomizes naturalist writing in that it represents four separate and distinct men being controlled by circumstances, the struggle for survival on an angry sea. Perfect. Now, she then pulls in with some evidence from the story. Each of these men at different times struggled with the idea of their mortality with a great deal of rage. Good. Even more evidence. And then this statement here, this is the perfect example of the naturalist representation of the intermingling of life of the controlling forces and individual worth, which is perfect. Main idea, evidence, some analysis, and that kind of link back, which I really think makes for a very strong paragraph, and I think it's a good model to use, and I appreciate that, Kathy. I also saw that Corey really did a good job of condensing. I like the way that it's laid out. I would love to see more evidence in here, kind of what Kathy did. Maybe just a little bit. I'm going to tell you what I think. I'm going to show you why I believe it. A little bit of evidence would always help. And I would suggest the same with Brittany. Although I love that she uses the phrase rawness, because there is a sense of the visceral here. This is the sense of the kind of the almost too harsh to look at reality, and I really like that frame. I appreciate I appreciate that your observations. One second, I'm sorry. I just have a quick little one of those things. Okay. I appreciate the aspect of the naturalism subject matter. I like that Deborah mentioned that. I think that the subject matter is just as important as the way it is told or as how it is told. I also think that Dennis's observations, once again, this is a great way to kind of explore. I love the idea from Washington, this epic true life story with a few lines, this idea of social lived through, like this idea of this is a real person. This is a pessimistic or not, this is a person that lived. Mary Orsini's observations are absolutely fantastic, and I think that it's a good model and a good structure here. I also see the sadness, and in a sense, many of these readings for this week were kind of disturbing. Disturbing in a sense that you knew that they were related to some sense of truth or some sense of the natural or the real. I do also appreciate the observations that Abby made. I think the use of evidence is highly evolved in this one, and I really think the idea of naturalistic concepts is very cleverly and clearly explored in this posting. I think it's a definite model for you guys to examine and to take a look at. In addition, I do think that Elijah's observations are good. I would like a little more meat, a little more support, a little more evidence. I think that would be very helpful. And taking a look at some of the postings that I've kind of called out as good examples would really help. For the most part, though, you guys did an excellent job of really engaging some fairly difficult material. Really thinking about naturalism not just as a concept that appears in literature, but also as a historical and cultural moment. And I think that is really seen not just in your reading of Gilman and of Crane, but also in your reading of the African American literature and the sense of Du Bois and the sense of Washington. I really do look forward to kind of seeing how you guys are continuing to develop your points of view. In fact, whoops, in fact, what we will be doing for this coming week is you're going to be doing a number of readings. So as you know, you can go ahead and access under assignments, week 4, which is modernism poetry. We're going to be rereading Marianne Moore, Ezra Pound, and T.S. Eliot. Eliot's The Wasteland is fairly robust. You will also have access to a podcast that you'll want to go ahead and watch. Um, it's a podcast on plot, which it kind of will help you not just with this readings, but with the other readings. And then, of course, if you go to the discussion area, you will see that your postings and your prompts for this week really do relate to the sense of modernism, but also relating to some ideas of poetry. So if you do have any observations, concerns that you would like to address with me, please feel free to contact me via email, Ask Your Instructor, or of course the Blackboard IM area. Thanks so much, and I look forward to seeing your work. Have a great week.